All right, welcome everyone to our Adams County Reads One Book program. And tonight I'd like to introduce Matthew. And Matthew, if you want to go ahead and take it away, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. My name is Matthew March. I'm the Education Director at the Cumberland County Historical Society. And what I'm going to talk about are some of the roles of abolitionists and the Underground Railroad in Cumberland County. I'm going to speak briefly, kind of give us all kind of a common background. And then I do have a couple slides just to enhance the program, kind of give you some visuals besides my face. So if I kind of share screen and I disappear, don't be alarmed. But I'd like to start off talking about slavery in America, just so that everybody kind of starts at the same place, especially with us Northerners, because I grew up here. I'm in Boiling Springs, Pennsylvania. And, a lot of times as I was going through school, the idea and what I was told was, hey, we're the North. We're the good guys. We were the ones fighting to free the slaves. And in a lot of cases, that's not accurate. So I like to start off by, making sure everyone knows that, slavery was legal and every colony had slaves, including Pennsylvania. They originate from the 400,000 Africans that are taken and brought across the Atlantic here to the Americas. And, that's really only a tiny fraction of the total number of African slaves that were taken. Most were sent to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations. And, some of them did come here to what we now know as, the United States of America. So that includes Pennsylvania. And where I'm at, Cumberland County, we were a slave holding county. In fact, we held slaves in Cumberland County longer than any other county in Pennsylvania. The latest date I've ever seen or found slaves on tax records is 1844. So not too long before the Civil War. Our county really leaned more towards the South. And that has a lot to do with our geography, where we are located in the Cumberland Valley. And that valley, kind of bends and goes south. And if you simply go 70 miles south, you are now in the Shenandoah Valley. And so our natural trading partners were Northern Maryland and Northern Virginia. So places, Hagerstown was a big one. Baltimore was a big one. It was a lot easier to get there than it would be to go all the way to Philadelphia. So, we have slaves here early, and kind of, being that the Quakers were in power in Pennsylvania, there are early movements to abolish slavery. But, it's kind of one of those weird things where even William Penn, who founded this Commonwealth on the idea of personal liberties, he even owned slaves. So, kind of might go against what we've grown up with as Northerners. Now, I was mentioning Pennsylvania was the first state to try to legislate away slavery. And that happens in 1780 with, it was called the gradual, or an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. Now, what that does though, is it's one of those legislations where it's kind of feel-good legislation, where they set up a system that says that at that time, all slaves were to be registered. Any slaves that were not registered could have sued to be manumitted. However, any children of slaves born after November 1st, 1780 were to be enslaved until they were 28 years old. any children that they had before they were 28 years old were to be enslaved until they were 28 years old, and so on and so on. So even though it is legislation mentioning that we're trying to abolish slavery, it actually sets up a system where slavery could have gone on forever. And once we start legislating, you kind of have this chess match back and forth where the North is trying to diversify, and the southern states, they are really concentrating on cash crops, large plantations. Really, they need the labor, and so you have this kind of back and forth chess match in the federal government of trying to out legislate one another. So of course you have the Declaration of Independence, where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, some men were created equal in the eyes of the founding fathers. In 1787, when the United States Constitution gets ratified, you have Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, which really addresses, not slavery, but labor. And it says, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Now, when the Quakers enacted that legislation to gradually abolish slavery, that really kind of starts the cat and mouse of, well, if you can be free in the North, well, let's try to escape to the North. Let's seek our freedom in the North. And then with the southern states having a lot of power in the federal government, well, they get that clause put into the Constitution that, well, you can try to get there, but that doesn't mean you are free. We can always come and get you. And then you kind of have this retaliation where Pennsylvania is going to start creating what were known as personal liberty laws that, gave freedom seekers a little bit more leeway if they can get across the border. In 1808, we finally have the federal law that is going to prohibit the importation of African slaves. But by that time, that is where we already had about 400,000 here in the States. By the Civil War, that 400,000 will be turned into about 4 million. So in a really short amount of time. Now, this really kind of brings in the Underground Railroad aspect, where we have, freedom seekers trying to get to the North for their freedom. Places like Philadelphia were very, key for the abolition movement. And so, trying to get north really was the goal. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So when we talk about the Underground Railroad, and I'm trying to get us all from a common point. So underground does not mean, obviously, we're digging holes in the earth. Of course, in some cases, there were secret passages, but underground meant it was a secret. This would have been, if you were trying to assist freedom seekers getting their freedom, you would have been breaking federal law. You would have been breaking the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So it definitely had to be a secret, kept in confidence. Railroad does not mean, we're traveling on trains, although in some cases there were freedom seekers who found their freedom on the literal railroad. Railroad in this case means this loose network. It was really kind of a nebulous of, different ways to get north to your freedom. Or, I'm talking about Pennsylvania, of course, but if you were in, say Alabama, you're probably not going to try to go north because that's a very long distance. There were easier ways to get out of Alabama, like the Gulf of Mexico, of course. So we have that Underground Railroad, popping up in the late 1820s, early 1830s. And today, when you might read books about the Underground Railroad, you might see articles written about it. There still are some, fallacies about the Underground Railroad. And I just like to point these out. If you're heading north, maybe some of you have heard, the way they found their way north was, of course, by feeling a tree for moss, because one of the thoughts was that moss only grew on the north side of trees because it's the least sunny side. Well, that's not accurate. Moss can grow on any side of a tree where the conditions are right. And I included this picture just because there's moss everywhere. And if you were trying to find your way north by feeling the moss, you would be turned around in circles quite quickly. There is also even turned into a song, Follow the Drinking Gourd. The drinking gourd, of course, reflecting the Big Dipper. Now that one is accurate. You can use celestial navigation because the Big Dipper will point us to the North Star, which in our lifetime will always be pointing north. However, it would need to be nighttime, and it would also need to be a clear night. So it's very circumstantial using that follow the drinking gourd. Now, to kind of impress upon you how dangerous it was to escape or to seek your freedom. This is a poster I pulled from our archives, and this is offering a $60 reward for one 16-year-old girl. And this is 1832. In 1832, if you were a laborer and you earned $100 a year, you were doing all right, and you could support a small family on that amount. So this is offering almost a year's wages to catch one 16-year-old girl. This was a very lucrative business, slave catching, because this was capital. This was an investment, and people were not going to just let their this huge investment of capital just disappear off into the north seeking their freedom. And so places like Chambersburg, a lot of the border areas, these were renowned slave catching towns where there were gangs that would just simply wait on the main streets and wait for African Americans to walk by, and they would accost them and try to figure out if they belong there, if they were running away, because it was a very high paying a career. It was a very high paying, it was a very rewarding proposition. In the time before photography, this is also an incredible description of someone, down to the types of, her shoes, a coarse pair of shoes with high quarters and nailed with sparrow bills. So these were very descriptive as well. Now, if perchance you did get caught, you of course were going to be taken back to your owner, because that's how they received the reward. And most likely you are going to be punished in person, or in front of others, so that it shows everyone else this is what happens when you try to get your freedom. People would be punished very severely. And then a lot of times, they just simply might be sold. And that was one of the big worries that we find when we see some firsthand accounts of freedom seekers. And they said that, the reason they, left was because they feared they would be sold further down south. As we get into the 1840s, 1850s, slavery is waning here in the North and the mid-Atlantic, and the real need is in the deep South, and very good money would be paid for slaves to be sent down into the deep South. And that was a huge fear, and one of the big reasons why people did seek their freedom. So I was mentioning geography a little bit earlier, and you can see, where we are. You're just over the mountain from me. So I'm on the north side of the South Mountain, and this is the Cumberland Valley. And it's just this tiny little part of what's known as the Great Appalachian Valley. If you just go right down here, this is the Shenandoah Valley, the James River Valley, Roanoke, and it goes all the way down to right about Alabama. And so you have all those kind of fallacies about, how can I get north? Well, we can follow the stars. Yes. The easiest way would be to get in this valley and don't cross a mountain. As long as there have been human beings in this area, so 10,000 years, they've used this valley really as a natural kind of funnel for human migration. It's always been used in that capacity. Humans have always known it's easier to walk in a valley than over a mountain. And when I'm talking about the Underground Railroad and freedom seekers in our area, they're not coming from deep in the South. They're coming from Western Maryland, or I should say Northwestern Maryland, and Northern Virginia. And keep in mind, there is no West Virginia at this time in history. So this has really been a natural kind of funnel, and it served that same purpose during the Underground Railroad days as well. If we look a little more in depth, I have a map here, and this is taken out of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania by Swatala, and it shows some of the routes or routes. So we have our Adams County right here. I've tried to shade in what we would all know as what's today Michaud State Forest. And that really is you can think of that as the South Mountain. So this would all be mountain. Adams on the eastern side, Franklin on the western side, Cumberland County to the north and a little bit west as well. And those freedom seekers coming from Maryland and Virginia, the Underground Railroad's very situational, and it had to be depending on who was in the area. If people were looking for you, that is why you had these conductors, people that were willing to help you because they had information. Because you wouldn't want to be sent to where there was a gang of people looking for freedom seekers. So there were several loose routes that would lead into Cumberland County. Excuse me. One of the most famous gets explained by a man named Hiram Wirtz. And he gave a lecture in 1911 claiming to be the last conductor of the Underground Railroad in this region. And this is also I need to digress a little bit. This is also one of those things where the Underground Railroad, as a secret, it's hard to find a lot of information about it because people generally were not writing down or documenting the fact that they were breaking federal law. Also in our area, my area, Cumberland County, we really leaned towards the South. We kind of leaned more into slavery. And so if you were someone who was outspoken and your neighbors found out, you really could be cut off from your community. If the guy who sold you your groceries finds out and he is, he might not be a slave owner, but he might not have cared and just felt that, what's wrong with it, you could be cut off and it's going to make life a lot more difficult. So we have, some documentation. A lot of it comes from years afterwards when people are remembering. And I do have a really good story, a very specific one, and it is 100% documented. There are lots of oral traditions of Underground Railroad activity in Cumberland County. I know you all in Adams County have a rich tradition, and it's pretty well documented. I've been on the tour through Adams County, but some of the kind of oral traditions we have here in Cumberland County really kind of relate to the town of Carlisle, because this is not always what you might think of as like white citizen do-gooders. There were lots of African Americans who helped with the Underground Railroad, lots of freed Blacks in Carlisle. Carlisle had a very large Black population, and they were, willing to help. They knew what these people had been through and they were willing to risk it. And one of my favorite oral traditions is of an African American barber in Carlisle. His name was John Peck. And we know he was into abolition because he was a member of the Abolition Society. He was also a member of a young men's club called the Toussaint Louverture Club, which relates back to a the Haitian slave revolt in the late 1700s. And I love his story because, if you think about it, he was a barber. And, these people coming into Carlisle and going to this barber, well, what are they going to need to get their freedom? Well, one, they're going to need information. And even at my barber shop today, there are just a bunch of guys sitting around, not even getting their hair cut, just talking about everybody in town's business. So the barber knew what was going on throughout the whole town. He had all the information. Plus, even to this day, some barbers are only dealing in cash. So a barber could have ready money, and having real money would be an extreme, a tremendous benefit to these freedom seekers. Now, unfortunately, John Peck's story has been passed down, but it was never documented during the time, at least to where I have found in my research. So I'm going to talk about some of the more well-established, more well-documented parts of the Underground Railroad. And so into Cumberland County, we really have a couple rather famous routes. And one was coming across the border and entering Rouserville. And I believe that's only about 4 to 6 miles across the border. And there was the man I mentioned earlier, Hiram Wirtz. And in his story that he told in 1911, he said that the famous, Matthew Dobbin of Gettysburg had come and lived on his family farm when he was just a little boy and had taught him, how the Underground Railroad, excuse me, how the Underground Railroad operated and how he could help. And he took those lessons and he applied them. And so it was his job to escort freedom seekers that had just crossed the border, and he would take them to Caledonia Furnace. the furnace owned by famed abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens. And there, the superintendent of the furnace would then usher them through the forests to another furnace known as Pine Grove Furnace, which for a while was owned by famed Iron Master Michael Egge, EGE. And then from Pine Grove, going to Mount Holly Springs, then on to Boiling Springs, then Mechanicsburg, and then get across the river to Harrisburg, which had the largest Black population in our region. You know, ultimate goals being to get to Philadelphia, New York City. The ultimate would be if you could get to Canada. Being a different country, no fugitive laws could affect you there. If you got to Canada, you were totally free. So that was one route. You could, of course, come up through the Gettysburg into York Springs, Mount Holly, Boiling Springs, Mechanicsburg, Harrisburg. This is all the mountain here. You could also come up the valley. And a lot of the freedom seekers coming out of Hagerstown would use this route. So Hagerstown to Chambersburg, then on to Shippensburg. What's convenient is these are all about a day's travel, a day's walk apart. That's a hard day's walk. About each of them are about 16 to 20 miles apart. Then there was a furnace at a place called Pine Grove. And if I can find my cursor, Huntsdale. Today there is a Pennsylvania fish hatchery there. And that would be right about here where my cursor is. Then from Huntsdale, there was a place called Burkholder's Cider Press. That was on a private farm on the Walnut Bottom Road, which was one of the main roads exiting Carlisle to the west. And then again to Boiling Springs, Mechanicsburg, and then Harrisburg. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this was very situational. Maybe you couldn't get to Boiling Springs, and some people might not have had any help and just might have walked right up the valley. And Perry County to our north, they have a very rich tradition of the Underground Railroad as well. So coming to Carlisle and then crossing over North Mountain. So those are our real two big routes. And here we go. The one I mainly want to talk about here, it kind of gets its own specific name, and I find it amazing. So again, I've shaded what's roughly Michaud State Forest today, or South Mountain. And so, if you are coming up, you might hit Pine Grove, Shippensburg, Huntsdale, Mount Holly Springs, Boiling Springs. And what happens here is this gets to be known as the Iron Route. And it's called the Iron Route because all of those locations had iron furnaces. And you might ask, well, why would they go to iron furnaces? Well, all of these well, not all, but a lot of these iron furnaces, they previously had a lot of African and African-American laborers, some who were enslaved, some who were free. And so around all of these iron communities, there were African-American settlements. And you might read in some Underground Railroad books about, well, they will go to the mansion at Pine Grove. Well, in my estimation as a historian and in my research, I would not think they would go to the mansion because the Egge family who owned Pine Grove, Mount Holly, and the Boiling Springs, those furnaces, they were slaveholders. But you would want to go to the communities that sort of, basically the Black communities that were located there. Again, because those people knew what you were going through and would be willing to help you. And so here in this map, we have some of the documented Underground Railroad participants. So you have the Samuel Taylor Farm here on the western side of the county, a little bit north of Shippensburg. Richard Wood's Farm, John Morrison, Stephen Weekly, and there's that Jacob Burkholder cider press I was mentioning earlier. And then, of course, the Daniel Kaufman Farm here in Boiling Springs. And that leads me to Daniel Kaufman. Daniel Kaufman's story is very interesting because, for one, this is the only picture that we know exists of him. And this is from when they printed his obituary. Now, Daniel Kaufman was the founder of the village of Boiling Springs. Everything that is the village today was part of his family farm, originally owned by his father, Abraham Kaufman. Now, it's kind of funny because, in his own words, he said that, he had started working as a conductor on the Underground Railroad when he was about 17. And he had assisted probably around 70 freedom seekers get their freedom. And to the best of his knowledge, none of them were ever captured or retaken. And it's funny that we know about Daniel Kaufman, even though he was a member of this secret organization. And the only way we know about him is because he gets caught. And how he gets caught is pretty fascinating in that in October of 1847, there are two families, 13 people in all. Their owner had died and they were in Arkansas. And so they were picked up and they were taken to be moved to Maryland. And as a way to settle family debts and ensure the children got an inheritance, they were going to be sold. And they were even told that, this isn't the situation where, hey, we have a nice family here we would like to sell. They were told, and it's in quotes in some testimony, that this was going to be just like a horse auction, meaning, the most money is going to win. And these families knew they were going to be split apart. And in a lot of these cases, they would be split apart so far, mom could go to Alabama, dad to Georgia, your sister to Virginia, your brother to Florida, your other sister to Texas. So far apart, you would never see your family again. And they decided to take the huge risk of getting their freedom. Now, what's amazing is that 13 people, 13 freedom seekers at one time is an extraordinary amount of people. In most cases, it would be a single young man running away. 2 and 3 happened occasionally, but 13 at once was very unlikely. For one, it was presumed you were easily going to be caught. And it was just a huge risk. So it did not happen a lot. And these 13 freedom seekers, they know what their fate is going to be, so they decide to run away. And they make their way across the Maryland border into Pennsylvania. And in Chambersburg, they're met by an African-American gentleman, part of the Underground Railroad. His name was George Cole. And he led them up the valley. And he slowly was making his way to Boiling Springs. The idea was to get to the iron furnace in Boiling Springs, specifically to get to that Black community. beside the iron furnace in Boiling Springs. However, upon getting close to the furnace, they realize that there is a lot of commotion going on, and they can't really get to the furnace without making a big scene. And where they make a mistake is that they stop and they ask a man, how can we get to Daniel Kaufman's house? We don't want to go by the tavern in Boiling Springs because, there's a lot of people there. We don't want to go by the store, which is right on the main street, because that's where a lot of people are hanging out. So can you tell us how we can get to Daniel Kaufman's kind of the back way? And the man gives them some directions down some kind of obscure lanes, and they are to follow the Yellow Breeches Creek right to Daniel Kaufman's property. And George Cole leads them, and he goes right to Daniel's barn, and he puts them in the barn. He then goes to the house and knocks on the door and kind of says, hi, Daniel, basically. And Daniel asks him what his business is. And he says, I would rather show you than tell you. So he takes him into the barn and shows him these 13 freedom seekers. And it does worry Daniel Kaufman that they are on his property. And it's kind of a situation where he's like, well, what are you going to do with them? And George Cole asks him if he could feed them. And Daniel agrees. And he puts them in his animal stables so that they can be a little more well hidden, feeds them and lets them get rest. Well, of course, they did not do this in total anonymity. People saw them, and they figure out, that they've asked where Daniel Kaufman lives. So some of the local villagers come to Daniel's house, and they're knocking on the door, and they say, hey, Daniel, do you have any runaways here? And he says, of course I don't. Well, Daniel, we know they're here because they asked where you live. He says, okay, well, if you promise not to tell, they are here. And they agree, and that was good enough for Daniel. And a couple of the local village men actually get to talk to the two fathers of these freedom seekers. And one of the things that these fathers, really stress is that if anybody comes and tries to take them back down south, that they're willing to fight to the death to get freedom for themselves and their families. And it satisfies the locals' curiosity, and they leave. Later on, through testimony, we find that one of those local villagers actually was trying to kind of get a posse together to come and capture them to get the reward. However, later that evening, Daniel puts them in his wagon, takes them to a place in the town of Mechanicsburg, which we do not know, because this was a secret. And they disappear to history. However, it was very easy for slave catchers to track 13 African Americans coming up the valley. And they get tracked right to Daniel Kaufman's front door. And being that he was the only person where they were seen on his property being given aid, he gets taken to court, and he is sued in Cumberland County in what we call our old courthouse now. And he is tried by Judge Samuel Hepburn. And in a southern leaning, kind of more pro-slavery county, Daniel Kaufman is found guilty. And he's fined $2,000, which then that was a fortune then. Now, his lawyer is pretty savvy, and they appeal, and it goes to the state court. And they're using the argument basically that, well, he might be guilty, but this isn't a county problem. He broke a federal law. So, you can't call him guilty here in Cumberland County. And it takes 2 years, all the way to 1849, that this case works its way to a federal circuit court in Philadelphia, where Daniel Kaufman is ultimately found guilty. Now, for him, this was not a you're going to go to jail crime. This was, we're going to fine you so much money that you'll never be able to help anybody again. And with all the court cases, the county case, the state case, and the federal case, all those fines stacked up, the total comes to about $5,000 in 1849. And it really breaks him financially. He had founded the village of Boiling Springs in 1845, but it really explodes in growth in 1849 when he has to start selling off more lots. He is selling off his livestock. He is borrowing money from his in-laws. He also has two co-conspirators in the federal case. One's his brother-in-law, Stephen Weekly, who really bears the biggest part of the fines, and also a local Boiling Springs villager named Philip Breckbill, who was the man who had a farm and owned the Boiling Springs Tavern at the time. So now, of course, if everybody knows you're a member of a secret organization, it's no longer a secret. And so Daniel financially cannot help anyone. And for obvious reasons, he, no longer can be what would be called a station master on the Underground Railroad or a conductor. Fortunately, his brother-in-law, Stephen Weekly, really takes over those duties. Even more fortunately, in less than 15 years, the need for an Underground Railroad will cease. But to kind of give you a little taste of Daniel's attitude, when the Confederates invade in the summer of 1863, they come up the valley, take over Chambersburg, Shippensburg, and they encamp around Carlisle for several days. Well, some of them come here to Boiling Springs and they're looking, and they are looking for that expletive abolitionist Daniel Kaufman. They, of course, don't find him, and they find out that they are needed at the Battle of Gettysburg. And so they have to march right through the gap at Mount Holly Springs, right through it's a gap in the South Mountain. And as the Confederate army of, roughly 15,000 would be a conservative estimate, as they're marching right through the gap, Daniel and his brother-in-law climb to the highest parts of the mountains that surround the gap, and they take pot shots. They're just shooting at the Confederates as they are leaving this area. And that's really kind of how he felt about the situation. Now, I had mentioned his brother-in-law, Stephen Weekly and Philip Breckbill. What makes this so amazing is that this is truly the only 100% documented Underground Railroad story and station in Cumberland County. So much so that it is now marked on the National Park Service's Network to Freedom as one of their sites, along with Carlisle, where this nationally famous court case happened, dealing with the issue of fugitive slaves. And also the Cumberland County Historical Society, because we held the documents and we did all the research. Now, kind of on a personal note, I feel very lucky as an historian because I got to buy the Daniel Kaufman homestead. So I live, and my house is documented as a part of the Network to Freedom. Now, we have another pretty well documented case, not so much dealing with the Underground Railroad, but with the issue of, fugitive slavery. And conveniently for storytelling, it happens in the same exact year, 1847. And it involves a man named John McClintock. And how the story happens is that there are three freedom seekers, and They are coming up from Maryland. They cross the border. There is a man named George, his daughter Anne, and then a separate woman named Hester. And they make it across the border, and they go to Hester's husband's house, who lived outside of Shippensburg. That's another aspect of the idea of slavery that might astonish people, is that you might be married, but you might not have permission to even be with your spouse. So they make it to Hester's husband's house with slave catchers hot on their trail. And the slave catchers and the owner, a man named Kennedy, they actually bust into the husband's house. They beat up the husband, and they literally grab these slaves. They grab them and remove them from the property. Now, some of those personal liberty laws I was mentioning earlier, one of them said you just can't come and grab people and snatch them up. That could be considered kidnapping here in Pennsylvania. And so the slave owner knows this, and he knows that he needs to go to a courthouse and get literally a legal document from a judge saying that these people are my property. I did not kidnap them. And so Kennedy has to take these freedom seekers to Carlisle, to what we call our old courthouse, to prove that they are his property. Now, he takes them in, and again, this court case is also heard by Judge Samuel Hepburn. And the courtroom is actually in the upstairs, so it's on the second floor. It is magnificent. If you ever get an opportunity to go inside, please do. It is in the exact same condition as it was then. And in 1847, this was a brand new courthouse. And so he is going to plead make his case to the judge. But as he brings these African Americans into Carlisle, word spreads around a small town quickly. And so Carlisle had a large free Black population at that time. And so the word spreads, and they don't want to see these people taken back down south. And so people start congregating around the courthouse, going in to hear what's happening. And so this slave owner becomes worried. And he says, Judge, will you have these slaves taken to the county jail, which is only 1 block away, and lock them up until we can get this figured out, because I don't want them getting away. And so they are taken and put in the jail. And it is at this time when they get a volunteer counsel. His name is Stephen Adair. And he is going to speak for these freedom seekers. Well, he realizes that you shouldn't have a court case about somebody if they can't be there. So he provides a writ of habeas corpus, and in Latin that roughly means, produce the body, bring them here. They need to be here to hear this. So they are brought back to the courthouse. It is at this time when Dickinson College professor John McClintock was walking right into the middle of town, right by the courthouse, to get his mail, basically across the street at the post office. And he hears what's going on. Now, he was a mathematics, a Greek and Latin professor, but one of his passions was the law. And so he hears what's going on, and he says, if this is true, well, the judge is breaking the law. And so he goes into the courtroom, and he tells the judge, Judge, there was a law recently passed, and it's another one of those personal liberty laws of Pennsylvania. It says there was just a law passed several weeks ago that says Pennsylvania has forbade any official from helping slave owners get their property back. And that's one of those chess moves. Federal government says you can't help slaves get away, Pennsylvania says, okay, well, we won't let any government officials help slave owners get their property back. And, he's basically telling the judge, you don't know the law. And he says, I have a copy in a law magazine that I get, and I will go back to my house and I will retrieve it to show you. He heads back, and, this really worries this slave owner, Kennedy. And so again, he says, would you please take them to the jail while this is all getting sorted out? And by this time, the courtroom is packed. You have free African Americans basically on one side saying, hey, we know what they're going through. We don't want to see them sent back to the South. And then you also have what in testimony were called the lowest sorts of the community, saying, hey, they are property and they should go back with their owner. And you have these two completely differing ideas, outlooks, really, bringing a fever pitch to the courtroom. The sheriff is tasked to take these three freedom seekers to the jail, and a move is made to try to free them in the courtroom. And he has to pull his gun out, and he holds people back by pointing his gun, leads them down the stairs, out the front door, and the police wagon is waiting right out front, and they are just steps away from getting put into the wagon and locked up when all craziness just breaks out. People just start throwing rocks, they're swinging sticks, they're fighting. And in all this commotion, these three freedom seekers get liberated. And they make their way down an alley. And for storytelling, this is great because they really escape down Liberty Avenue. And they are hidden in a basement, and they disappear. In all the commotion, the owner trying to chase them down gets knocked over and basically trampled by the mob. And they kind of scoop him up. They take him to the doctor. The doctor says, oh, you're going to be fine. A couple days later, he's dead. And this causes a national stir, centered right on Carlisle. And later that evening, a knock at John McClintock's door, and it says, John, you have just been cited with starting a riot. And it is he and 23 African-American co-conspirators. They do go to trial. This is a huge deal because half of the students at Dickinson College at the time were from the South. And it was feared, and people even said, do not send your children to Dickinson College because they have abolitionists working there. And this made national, all the national news. And so they scheduled this trial very quickly because they want to get this resolved. And, John McClintock tries to bring on some of the best representation. He asks Thaddeus Stevens, abolitionist and lawyer, to be his lawyer, and he refuses, saying that basically they hate me so much, they'll find you guilty just because I'm your lawyer. So he has to find different counsel. He also asks to be heard separately from all of his co-conspirators, and that is denied. But in the end, he is acquitted, along with 13 of his co-conspirators. Several or many are found guilty, right around 10. And they are sentenced to 3 years in probably the worst prison in America at the time, Eastern State Penitentiary. And they were sentenced to solitary confinement. And if you've ever been to Eastern State Penitentiary, this is one of those places where they bring you in hoods. When they say solitary, they mean silence. They had designed the prison cells so that they weren't across from each other so that you couldn't even see another human being. And solitary confinement is, we know, the worst punishment besides execution. And it can drive you mad. And it takes John McClintock arguing for over a year, again, with that argument that, well, they might have broken the law, but they shouldn't be in a state prison. They should be in Cumberland County's prison. But it takes so long, and they've already been in the solitary confinement for so long, that they finally are released. And this was a big blow. Well, it could have been a big blow to Dickinson College, because I mentioned those students, a lot of the students were from the South, but fortunately, every single Southern student got together and they wrote a letter of support for John McClintock, and every one of them signed it. And this was such an outrage or not an outrage, but it made such a big impression in the national news that it doesn't take long for John McClintock that he just resigns his post at Dickinson College. And then he goes on to continue his career in, he becomes the editor of the Methodist, basically the Methodist newspaper and journal. And then he becomes a famed pastor. And that's how he finishes out his life. So, not so much Underground Railroad, but in some cases, you might not even consider that an abolitionist activity. Maybe rather just, someone knowing the law. But it would have been a really big deal simply to speak up for African Americans in a Southern-leaning town like Carlisle. So what I want to do is I'm going to stop my share. And all right, I did pretty well. I like to open up things to discussion, questions. I am more focused on Cumberland County. I do know a little bit about Adams County, not a lot, but a little. So, if you have some questions, please answer them. If you want to have a discussion point, I'd love to hear it as well.
So if you want, I could go first.
Sure, Ted.
Yeah, my name is Ted Hurt, and I live part-time in Adams County, and I've studied the Underground Railroad movement and abolition there. And maybe it's different because we're a little further east. I often wonder if the Pennsylvania legislature in 1780 really was inserting a time bomb in slavery, because demographically, slavery can only go on so long by virtue of generations. So I looked a little bit about an article, and it suggested that slavery was basically essentially finished by 1740 because the people aged out. And whether or not that was the purpose, it seemed like whoever was in charge knew that sooner or later that was going to be the situation. That doesn't say it was condemned or condoned, but at least it set the framework. And I guess what I'm wondering about is whether, do you think that Adams County was more progressive than Cumberland County because it didn't have the same sort of Southern connections?
I would agree with that, yes. And you had a larger Quaker element. In Cumberland County today, there are more Quakers than there were back then, or more Friends today than there were back then. And that's a question we get a lot is, well, what about all the Quakers? Well, we didn't really have a lot here in Cumberland County. And we had, a lot of the Scotch-Irish settlers were the ones who, came to the valley and really kind of founded the valley. And in a lot of cases, they really had no problems with slavery. So, I would say, yeah, Adams County was more progressive. I don't know the economics of both counties, but I know Cumberland County was a wealthy county. And the biggest driver of slavery were simply wealthy people that didn't want to work. And so you might have lots of wealthy people and they each might have 2 people enslaved. But then you also had all these iron, they were called plantations, all these iron plantations at the foot of the South Mountain. And they could have up to 14, 18 enslaved people at one location. And so, the economics kind of drove it here as well, where, making iron, you're standing beside basically a big oven that's several thousand degrees. It's a job that nobody wants to do. So, those were big drivers. And, I don't know if Adams County had more kind of diverse farms and diverse income, I should say. I hope it's kind of answering.
No, that was good. I think our problem, which is looking back, almost 200 years, is trying to figure out the demographics of the population and the industry and who ideologically was doing what, because Thaddeus Stevens was on one point, but others were not as empathetic, or they were more mercantile. So it's a difficult issue.
Well, and Carlisle was a military center as well. And a lot of the wealth is coming in, Carlisle is the second oldest military installation in America, or continually operating military installation in America. So, and with some of these officers, you're getting more wealth. So, I know there's a lot of wealth in the county, and that would lend itself to, and if you're Southern leaning, that's going to lend itself to more people enslaved. Anyone else have a comment, question, or Ted and I can keep it discussing things?
Well, I was going to say that this was a great presentation. And I think the resource I always rely on, and I know it's controversial, is the Howard Wirt saga of Adams County. And some people dispute that, but I think it's very interesting that there was a network in Adams County of abolitionists, not just the McAllisters. And what I found interesting about your presentation is whether, as we go west, is whether there's a different sentiment because of the proximity, which I hadn't thought about. So one other thing, as long as you know this, what about the issue about more Confederate incursions and re-enslavement of African Americans from the Jenkins raid?
I do not know a lot about that. So, if you could fill me in a little, I do know about the Jenkins raid a little bit.
Well, so all I know is that during Lee's campaign, on the one hand, he was telling his soldiers to respect private property, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that Jenkins cavalry were moving through your area, not Adams County, and that they were gathering up African Americans, slaves, non-slaves, we don't know, and sending them back south. And I don't think anyone knows the statistics or who they were, but it seems like there was this episode where these folks were just taken back south and no one knows what happened. In Adams County, doesn't seem like that happened.
Well, I do know that before that incursion by the Confederates, there was a wave of freedom seekers coming. And to kind of give you a little idea of some of Carlisle's feeling, the local headline in one of the Democratic newspaper was, and even some of the local free Black sentiment was, what are we going to do with all this contraband? And that's what they were called. And they saw it as this kind of influx. And, if you were free African-American in Carlisle and you were barely getting by, and now here comes a whole bunch of people that might take your job, they were even worried about it. And so I think that might, kind of piggyback with that sentiment of, we don't even know numbers. We don't know, they're not really worried about who's getting taken back down south. And just to kind of echo or how Southern leaning we were, with the military base in Carlisle, half of those soldiers there were from the South. And pre-Civil War, that was the site of the United States Army Cavalry Training Grounds. So, guys like Jeb Stuart trained in Carlisle. They knew the people of Carlisle. They dined with them when they were occupying Carlisle. So, Carlisle really had strong connections to the South.
So that's another question. I won't take over other people's time. But was the Carlisle political sentiment pro-Democrat or otherwise? Because Adams County was divided. And I wondered if was Carlisle like pro-Lincoln or anti-Lincoln?
Well, there were, if you think politics is bad now, there were competing newspapers. Back then there was, and Carlisle did lean Democrat, but they are literally yelling in the newspapers about, well, the Republicans down the street, they support Lincoln and we support private property rights. And I mean, it was vicious. So yeah, they did kind of lean more that way. And today, of course, with the reversal, it's a very strong Republican haven. I mean, it's, it hasn't, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know it's a stronghold.
Well, I will say from looking at this in 1860s, there's a clear division in Pennsylvania on each side of this. And a lot of people sort of assume the opposite.
Right, exactly. Well, if we don't have any questions or other discussion, I really want to express my gratefulness for having me. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Matthew. I know we all learned a lot from this presentation. It's always nice to put that kind of stuff into a local perspective to be like, oh yeah, to actually think of those places and how everything worked a long time ago. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and just like every great museum tour ends at the gift shop, I do want to say I do provide public walking tours of the Boiling Springs Underground Railroad sites. So I do one in the fall and I do one in the spring. My fall one's already happened, but I have one in April coming up. I also can be chartered. I do a lot of private tours. So if you can get a group together, I can go through Boiling Springs and depending on the day, we might even be able to get into the old courthouse if it's a weekday. But I would love to encourage you to, if you get the chance, come to the Cumberland County Historical Society in Carlisle. We have a wonderful free museum. And we do a lot of really cool things. If you want to find any information about us, we're pretty easy to find because we got in the web game early, and we are simply historicalsociety.com. So check us out.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight, Matthew. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us for this program. Keep an eye out. I think there are still a couple of programs this month for Adams County Reads One Book. So check out our website for any of those programs. All right. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.